So they're all going to have different internal mental models of how this thing works and in what are the relevant categories. Why does this matter? Here's why it matters. If we want to ask how good are we at forecasting something, you can prove the following theorem. You can prove that the crowd's prediction, so the crowd's error, equals the average error of the people in it minus the diversity of those people. So what does this mean? It means the ability of the crowd is sort of equal parts the ability of the people in it and their diversity. So collective wisdom depends on smart people who are diverse. The larger the problem is, the more dimensions there is to it, the more complex the problem is, the more interactions there are between the parts, the more important diversity is because of the fact the less accurate any one person can be. There's a wonderful book by Phil Tetlock called Expert Political Judgment. In some sense, the title is almost a joke, because what he does is he's basically coded predictions of the future by experts. And what he's found is that they're terrible. Experts are terrible at predicting the future. However, if you combine all the experts' predictions and average them up, they're actually not that bad. And the reason why is because you've got a diverse group of experts. So how does this work? If you take Galton Steer example, the crowd is off by a pound. The average error, these are squared, end up being, so that's like 57 pounds. So on average, people are off by 57 pounds. They also happen to be diverse. And because they were diverse, they were good. So now if we want to ask the question, when is it the case that crowds get things right? There's only two cases. One case is where everybody knows the answer. The other case is where the crowd is diverse. And by diverse, I mean they're bringing different ways of thinking, cognitive diversity, to bear on the problems. So let me give some other examples, and then I'll close up. I had my undergrads do this last week, and I had them guess the number of chairs at Seattle's Best Coffee out on Washtenaw. The crowd error was 76, which is about, they're off by 8 or 9 chairs. But their average error was 240. They're incredibly diverse. I also had them guess how long you keep sour cream in the fridge. Here their error was incredibly high, but they were diverse, and so collectively they were fine. Right? So again, what you get is, in some sense, the route of collective understanding is through capable, diverse people, right? So that's why, and let me extend to this, that's why I think conferences like this are so important, right? We have people who talked about slug lines. We have people talk about zip cars. We have people talk about these bike stations. We had someone talk about the transportation system in Madrid. Each of these people had a very different perspective, right? A very different take on what transportation was about and what the routes were, right? In some sense, maybe you could argue these were visionaries, but the thing is, we got very different understandings of how these systems work. If we really care about resilience, right, and this is, I think, Tom's point, I think there are at least 576 cases we've got to understand. The only way we're going to be able to forecast, predict, anticipate, right, and design within those 576 cases is if we bring not only perspective, but diverse perspectives, right, so that collectively we get a common understanding and a solid understanding of how the future is going to play out so that we can design systems that function for all of us at all these different levels we need them to function. Thank you very, very much.
My name is Nigel Melville. I'm with the Ross School of Business. Okay. So I have a question on the 576 cases. Yeah. It seems to me the idea of designing resilient systems is critical. Yeah. You mentioned it at the end. So my question would be, what do we know about designing resilient systems? And second, is it possible that design processes can reduce that set or that number into a smaller set?
So the question is, what do we know? And in some sense, I tried to about a little bit about what we know in general about sort of what makes systems robust. But what do we know about design of robust systems? I think that's I don't have a great answer to that question. Let me be blunt. So what little I know about that is that there's a lot of focus on modularity when we think about design, just because of the fact that because we're limited in what we can absorb, right? Because we tend to think of humans as being so expansive, but the fact is we really are so limited that when we think about design of a robust system, and this is why Tom was raising this point so much, is that modularity, it seems to be in my reading of that literature, that modularity seems to be a big focus, and there's an increasing focus on sort of this sort of multiple paths and diversity stuff, which is I think much needed. And Michigan has actually just started a design PhD program here to try and get at these sorts of questions, and my knowledge is limited to that. Can you reduce the 576? In some sense, I think you can't reduce the 576. And one of the things, but what you can do, though, is I think if you design something with the right core principles, you may not have to test all 576. So when they do these, when people test resilience of systems in some of these other systems, there's billions. Like if you think of genetic code, right? There's literally billions and billions of knockout experiments you could do, right? Because you could knock out each individual gene and you could knock out pairs of genes. So you can't do all those knockout experiments. And in fact, evolution hasn't even had the chance to do all those knockout experiments, as long as it's been. But what you can do is you can ask, do we have a set of common principles in place so that statistically, right, we know we can handle those? So, for example, if you said to me, like, if I were put in charge of, transportation in Chicago or something, or Detroit, God forbid, because that'd be terrible, but if I were, one thing you might think about doing is sort of, having a hat with the numbers 1 through 576 in it and pulling those suckers out, right, and just do a simple Monte Carlo, how are we doing on these things? And I think, you could, so I think statistically, you could take a statistical approach as opposed to doing all 576. I mean, that's how they do it within genetics.
I'm Irv Selmane. I've been associated with SMART for a long time. Scott, I wanted to lead you into another area that you have talked about, and it's essentially, the answer is 42. And the sense of these 576 getting sort of reduced to the red cars go fast heuristic. And you had some really interesting thoughts in the past about how people incorporate heuristics when you get these very, very complicated sorts of things. Can you sort of expand on that idea that you've developed in the context of this sort of problem?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things when you think about, let me throw this thing, maybe I can't. So, some of my other work looks at, if you think of individuals in terms of how we think, right, one thing that we have is we have all these sort of tricks, like, do the opposite, or we have little just sort of heuristic ideas that we think about. Let's imagine water flowing through the system and ask where it would get backed up or something like that. So one of the things I think that's really important to think about system design, and this is why I think diversity is so important, is having people who have lots of different tools and lots of different heuristics to come and look at a particular problem. So a couple weeks ago, the IMF had me in, and one of the points I was arguing to them is when they think about financial systems and who they hire, you typically think if you're the World Bank, you'd like to hire someone who's got a PhD in economics, who knows a lot of statistics, right, who maybe has worked in banking for a while, right, has always had a love of banking or something like that. The problem is if you hire all people like that 400th person you hire like that doesn't add much to the mix. And so one of the things I talk about is, maybe you should hire someone who studies networks, because the thing is, banks are networks. You care about the resilience of networks. Now, would I want one of these physicists who studies network theory running, even balancing my bank account? Probably not, right? But would I want to replace the 400th economist with one person who understands something about resilient networks at the IMF? Absolutely, right? Because they're going to add a lot to the mix. So I think the same is true here. And some of the comments that we heard this morning and also that we heard the other evening, when you think about all the domains in which transportation systems and mobility affects our lives, from environment to inequality to sort of pursuit of our passions, there's a sense in which it speaks very clearly to the need to have lots of different people at the table thinking about how these systems work, as opposed to just people who are transportation engineers, right? It seems like it really makes this sense that you want to have people who have training in all sorts of different fields, who have all sorts of different interests, right, and who have all sorts of different concerns, because they're going to bring sort of different cognitive tools to the table, and they're going to recognize not only potential fault lines in these systems, but also opportunities for change that are going to make these systems better. It's a long walk. It's like being on a game show.
Peter Sweatman, I just want to ask you mentioned on your list of kind of threats to resilience, innovation.
Yeah.
And we don't often think about it that way. So occasionally we see something like the shipping container that sort of changes everything over 40 or 50 years.
Right.
Do we have to think through all 576 cases to figure out what innovation is going to work for us and what isn't?
I think that.
A bit about that?
Yeah, so do you have to think through all? No, but I think that we do have to do is you have to think, when you think of an innovation, you've got to think about, what are the impact, right? Like the rabbits taking over New Zealand, for instance, right? So there's a lot of cases where people have sort of, especially in ecosystems, where people have said, let's just bring